thanks again, Dr. Halsey. What a privilege to come to such an extraordinary school and be back in Huntsville too. So the pleasure is entirely mine tonight. I'm often asked, and you can imagine why on earth, as an Englishman, am I interested in America? And I can give a lot of answers. I'm married to an American. I have a son who's proud to be British and American. But often I give the story of Winston Churchill. There was a time that the great British Prime Minister was visiting colonial Williamsburg. And the guide was showing the Prime Minister around, and she was waxing eloquent about the cradle of the revolution against the English. And then she suddenly realized who she was talking to. She apologized, and Churchill snorted. He said, "Nay, these were Englishmen with English ideas fighting a German king with his German mercenaries." And there's a good deal of truth in that. And the sad thing is for English, that many of your great ideas were English, but they flowered in this country in a way they never did in Europe. Although, as we'll get into tonight, in many ways they're under pressure again. So I feel a great affinity for many of these things coming to this country. I want to talk on freedom. And let me say very simply how I'm defining it and the challenge it is to sustain it. Freedom, very simply, is the capacity to self-determination. But of course that begs any number of questions. And Lord Acton, the greatest historian of freedom, put very simply, freedom is not the permission to do what we like. It's the power to do what we ought. And of course that begs many questions too. But let's plunge into this. In 1843, a young New England scholar was interviewing the last remaining veterans of the Revolutionary War. And among the people he met, he found an old gentleman who fought at Lexington and Concord in 1775, and the old boy was 91, 70 years older than the student. Captain Levi Preston. And the student nervously said to him, "Now, why did you go out to fight?" And the old gentleman was so surprised at a question with such an obvious answer, he didn't say anything at all. He just slowly straightened himself up to his full height. "Well, surely you were oppressed," the student said. "We weren't oppressed," he growled. "Well, what about the Stamp Act?" "Never paid a penny of it," he said. "Well, how about the tea tax?" "Never paid anything for that," he said. "The boys threw all the tea in the harbor before we got there." "Well, surely you'd read the great books on freedom, Sidney and Harrington and Locke and Burke." "Never heard of them," the old boy said. "The only books we had were the Bible, Isaac Watts's hymnal, and a farmer's almanac." And the interview went on like this, and the student was more and more puzzled, and he said, "Well, again, why did you go out to fight?" And Captain Preston gave this immortal answer: "We had always been free, and we intended to be free always. And the redcoats didn't mean that we should." Now there's a thought that deserves thought. Free always, always free. He wasn't unique. You can see generals like General Nathaniel Greene and the Founding Fathers themselves. And it's probably true to say that the most brilliant and the most daring thing that they did was to seek to build a free republic that could stay free forever. Although they knew well that no one had done it before, but freedom never lasts. Now you may know that St. Augustine argued that to really understand a nation, you look at what it loves supremely, or as he put it, its loved things held in common. And so his idea was, you don't just look at the size of a nation's population, or the throw weight of its missiles, to put it in modern terms, or its GDP, or prestige of its schools and universities. You look at what it loves supremely, and those loved things held in common. And if they're noble, the nation may be noble. And equally, if they're healthy and in great condition, that nation may be healthy and in great condition. And you can judge a nation and assess a nation any moment by looking at the loved things held in common that it loves supremely. Now, is there any question that what you Americans love supremely? Freedom. The land of the free, etc., 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 said in 1,000 ways. But how close are we to the understanding of the framers? Let me move from some simple propositions about what they were doing right through to where we are today. First, and very simply, consider the tasks they saw themselves tackling to build a free republic. There were three. They're very simple, very obvious. But the challenging thing is, the one that is our task today, many people neither know nor care about. The first task of building a free republic is to win freedom. And that's, of course, the revolution, 1776. And that isn't unique. Many revolutionaries have thrown off an ancien regime. The French in 1789, the Russians in 1917, the Chinese in 1949. That's not terribly unique, although that's the one that's most celebrated. The second task is to order freedom, to win it, to order it, to give freedom a political and moral framework in which it can thrive. That's, of course, not the revolution, but the Constitution, 1787. And the French and the Russians and the Chinese did not do it. And as you know well, their revolution spiraled down to demonic disorder that was worse than the tyrannies they replaced. And the genius of this country, the framers, won freedom and they ordered freedom. But they went on to a third task that many people forget. We need to sustain freedom, or as they put it, we need to perpetuate our institutions. Now, many people can quote Benjamin Franklin when he came out of the Philadelphia Convention, which you remember was secret. And Mrs. Powell said to him, "Mr. Franklin, what have you achieved?" "A republic, madam." You remember the next words? "If you can keep it. If you can keep it." And of course, that theme runs through many of the founders, and you can see it strongly in John Adams and James Madison, particularly as they approached the end of their days on earth, seeing how America was doing. And you found it in many American leaders after that. In the early 1830s, when Abraham Lincoln was only 28, only a few months in Springfield, Illinois, not that well educated, certainly not by Randolph standards, but when he was asked to address the Young Men's Lyceum and asked what his topic for the day was, he chose as his topic, the perpetuation of our institutions. And he says in the opening paragraphs, I want to give an accounts running of America 50 years after the Revolution. In other words, how are we doing 50 years on? And he shows some of the great pluses and many of the great minuses in terms of how we were doing. How many 28-year-olds would choose a topic like that today? How many national leaders are capable of giving an account running of where we are 230-odd years on? But the framers were very aware. Winning freedom, ordering freedom, sustaining freedom. But think of the second thing they were aware of. And that was the menaces to sustaining freedom. In other words, why free societies don't last. Now, they were undoubtedly revolutionaries. But those who celebrate just that forget they were also rooted. They quoted and read scores of the classics. And they ransacked the classical wisdom to understand how to do what they were doing in building a free republic. And above all, they looked at thinkers like Cicero, the great Roman orator and statesman and philosopher, and the Greek historian Polybius. Now, if you look at the classics, the classical authors were very aware of the major menaces why no political system lasts. The first reason, interestingly, the framers ignored. It didn't apply to them, they felt. That was an external menace. a nation can suddenly find itself with another nation better armed, larger, or whatever, and it's in trouble. And for obvious reasons, that wasn't their major concern. As one historian puts it, they came from a small protected island, most of them, except for John Jay, who came from France, most of them from Britain. They came from a small protected island, and now they lived on a large protected continent with the world's two greatest oceans as its buffers. So clearly the nearest serious enemies were 3,000 miles away. If you've read George Washington's farewell address, he doesn't take seriously the threat of external menaces. Equally, in that speech I mentioned by Abraham Lincoln, he openly poo-poos the idea of what he calls a transatlantic Bonaparte putting his feet down in the cornfields of Ohio. Unthinkable. Not a great danger. Of course, 1950s, intercontinental ballistic missiles, rockets, made not in Huntsville but elsewhere, and we take external menaces very seriously, especially following 19 box cutters and their ability to hijack airplanes and fly them into Manhattan. What's interesting, though, is the second and third menaces that they took seriously, we don't. The second menace is what Polybius, the Greek historian, calls a corruption of customs. And you may have read somewhere back when, Polybius, he outlines the different types of government. The ideal ones, monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. And then their corrupt forms, monarchy becoming tyranny, aristocracy becoming oligarchy, and democracy becoming mob rule. But then he says what's decisive for any country and system is its constitution. And I've been in discussions where Americans read that single sentence and almost yawn and turn off. You've got the world's most famous, longest surviving constitution, obviously all is well. No, said Polybius. Polybius argued what's decisive is a nation's constitution, but a constitution rests in a bedding of moral standards and values and traditions, which he calls in one word, customs. And if you have a corruption of customs, the best constitution in the world can be subverted. So that you still have the same name, but you don't have the same reality. And nations are most tempted, he said, to that subversion at times of their greatest power and their greatest prosperity. The third menace, in one word, is time. And you get this very vividly in Cicero. What's revolutionary one generation is routine to another, and taken for granted. It goes without saying, unsaid, forgotten. What's fresh in a painting, he said, becomes faded over time. The passing of time. You may know that the last volume of Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire was published the same year as the Constitutional Convention, 1787. And Gibbon's last chapter, he raises the question, why did Rome fall? And you remember he says, this was a fall beyond belief, 800 years. And the eternal city and the great empire fell. Why? And he gives several answers, but his first answer is the injuries of time. In the same speech by Lincoln, 28 years old, quite remarkable, Lincoln talks about, 50 years on from the Revolution, the silent artilleries of time doing damage to the ramparts of the Republic in a way that no external enemy could ever do. An extraordinary sense of time, which I'd say many Americans today hardly have. But where are the great civilizations? You visit their ruins. Angkor Wat, the pyramids, the Acropolis, the Colosseum in Rome. Do you really think for a minute that the Lincoln Memorial is immune to that in the course of history? No, the framers understood very well the passing of time. Christians added the passing of time and the presence of sin. Nothing in this world lasts forever. You remember Lincoln later, his speech in the hay wagon in Wisconsin, sending out, as he said, the monarch sending his wise men, the sages out to discover a truth that was true everywhere and in all times. They came back with a simple line, you remember, this too shall pass. Is any country immune from that? They understood that you had to build a system that challenged those sorts of menaces. Now let me break into their thinking and add something I didn't add to the students this morning, which is a modern understanding of the paradox of freedom. If you look at the history of freedom, the paradox of freedom is this: the greatest enemy of freedom is freedom. Now you can unravel that in various ways. Historically, one historian says if you pack 100 centuries of civilization into 1 hour, free society has only come in the last 5 minutes. They're brief and recent and fleeting. If you look at it politically, you can say, as the great French philosophers like Montesquieu and Tocqueville said, freedom is kept alive not only by the structures of liberty, but by the spirit of liberty. The structures of liberty are the Constitution and the law. Now you can lay those down so that they're, once in place, down forever. But the spirit of liberty has to be kept alive from generation to generation. And if it's ever lost, it's what Tocqueville calls the habits of the heart, the spirit of liberty in the citizens. If ever lost, freedom will not survive just by the structures. It needs the spirit. But the deepest understanding is actually moral behind the paradox. If you think freedom, that capacity for self-determination, freedom requires some ordering. But the only ordering that is appropriate for freedom is self-restraint. Not external restraint, but self-restraint. But self-restraint is precisely what's undermined when freedom flourishes. And among the main common ways by which freedom declines, the most common is that freedom without self-restraint becomes permissiveness and license and chaos and anarchy. And so you have this paradox that the greatest enemy of freedom is freedom. Now we inject that, which is not at the heart of their discussion, although the discussion is very close to it. But let me pick up the framers again. What were their antidotes to the fact that freedom had these great menaces, or as we could say, that it never lasts? What are the antidotes? They spoke a lot about it. One historian said it's so obvious in the framers, in their books, in their writing, their speeches, but it's like the 800-pound gorilla, which is in the room, but no one talks about it. They didn't give it a name. As I said, Tocqueville calls it the habits of the heart. And as you may know, in Democracy in America, he says, this country is great not because of geography, although it has extraordinary geography, but rather laws. And actually it's not great because of laws alone, but because of the habits of the heart. Freedom has become the spirit of liberty in the hearts of the citizens. And that's his understanding of how the framers thought of it. My own term for it is the golden triangle of freedom, not their term, mine. But if you read their speeches and their writings, they stress three things that are very like a triangle with 3 legs, and very like the recycling triangle, which goes round and round and round ad infinitum. You've seen it with the arrows and so on. These are the 3 legs of the triangle. First, freedom requires virtue. Secondly, virtue requires faith of some sort. And thirdly, faith of any sort requires freedom. Now, it goes round and round. Freedom requires virtue, which requires faith, which requires freedom, which requires virtue ad infinitum. Now, each of the legs that they stressed would be under assault today. Now, take the first. Freedom requires virtue. Virtue today is who's imposing whose values on whom, the idea of virtuecrats who are out to impose something on the rest of us or whatever. But for the framers, virtue, which of course is rooted in the Latin word for courage, was a one word which stood for all the ethical standards: honesty, loyalty, patriotism, character, and so on and so on and so on. Take, for instance, character. You know the framers loved words like inalienable, indefeasible, usually applying to freedom or rights or whatever. But John Adams, for example, has a sentence in which he uses words like inalienable, indefeasible, and several other words all in a row. And what's he describing? Not freedom, not rights. He's talking about the inalienable, indefeasible right of the citizens to know the character of their leaders. Why? Well, character is the bridge between leaders and followers. And followers can trust a leader even if they're in the dark, if they know his or her character. They know they can trust the person who's making the decisions that they themselves don't fully understand. Equally, they said, character is the bearings internally of the leader. So when he or she is faced with the temptations of power, maybe beyond the law, or certainly unseen, it's a matter of character that stops them doing what they could easily do. Now, you compare that today. I was saying this morning that when President Clinton was impeached, there was a famous letter to the New York Times by various American scholars saying character's irrelevant. What matters in a presidency today is competence, not character. Competence, not character. But the framers said, freedom requires virtue. John Adams, only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. The second leg, if you think, and they pointed out, what is the highest inspiration for anyone to be virtuous? Where is the clearest content of what virtue really means? And who talks about any sanctions for people who are not virtuous? Well, it's the faith-based talk. And while they were absolutely clear, adamantly clear, that everyone, whatever worldview, had the right of freedom of conscience, and certainly atheists too, they were very chary about a society of atheists because of the potential for a lack of genuine, strong virtue, which would be behind the citizenry. The third leg of the triangle, of course, is the most radical of all. And after 1,500 years of various European ways of establishment, one way or another, they were the first country to break with that and make all faith voluntary and a matter of individual conscience and the dictates of conscience. And the first 16 words of the First Amendment, the religious freedom clauses, are actually the most decisive and maybe distinctive parts of the American experiment. Not separation of powers. The First Amendment is far more original than that. The English had separation of powers, the Swiss had them pretty radically many centuries earlier. That isn't actually very distinctive. But the First Amendment truly is that faith of any sort truly requires freedom. Now that was their system. And I would argue that if you look at the antidotes to sustaining freedom, it is the most brilliant and daring solution that's ever been put forward in history. But many Americans today don't even know it, and many Americans today dismiss it. So let me move on to say why. Well, in the 20th century, a whole number of trends, some of them starting in the 19th, happened, which changed the whole picture. First, there was a privatization of religion. For the framers, religion, whatever religion it was something that integrated a person's whole life. But with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, you saw the tendency to privatize religion, so as one scholar put it later, it was privately engaging, publicly irrelevant. And clearly a faith like that is not capable of doing what the Founding Fathers thought needed to be done. The second powerful trend, this time excluding religion, was in the 20th century, stemming largely from the fame of John Rawls's book, A Theory of Justice, in 1973, in Harvard, 1971. And if you've read that book, you know that Rawls argues that faith and character and virtue are private. They're inviolably private. So the public square is a neutral arena of competing self-interests where faith and character and virtue have no part at all. You merely have economic or legal or rational or technological procedures, and that's why it's often called proceduralism, but genially excluding what the founding fathers would have considered central. The third trend in the last century is the most radical of all, unfortunately the most limited of all, which is postmodernism. And if you know, at the heart of Nietzsche's contribution to postmodernism is his idea that there is no such thing as truth. What we call truth is really the will to power. So you deconstruct all sorts of claims to knowledge and truth and other things and see the power agendas and interests behind them. So the founding fathers, Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, a high-flown way of covering the fact that they were tidal water plantation owners who were keeping their slaves down, and this rhetoric had no application to the reality of their lives. They were hypocrites, and we should deconstruct it and dismiss them. Now, it's clear that the founders had very, very serious blind spots. And their treatment of slaves, their treatment of Native Americans, and their treatment of women are the three prime examples that they are attacked for today, and they certainly are egregious faults. But that said, there's no question that many of the things they devised are brilliant. I mentioned religious freedom. They got that nearly right from the very beginning, unlike some of these others. And so those who throw the founders out, baby bathwater and all, are really foolish because they're throwing out some of the greatest wisdom the world has ever seen put forward. But it's quite clear that there isn't a general understanding, let alone a general appreciation of the founders today. So what are the current crises of freedom? Well, first, you have what I've virtually indicated. You have a serious alienation of leaders. It's often said in any country, if enough of its thought leaders are at odds with what makes it great, that country is bound to be in trouble sooner or later. And you can see serious pockets of the educated world in this country with an open scorn and dismissal of the framers and many other things that they talked about, such as Americanism and so on and so on. It's not everywhere. There are many great intellectuals passionately committed to the American Republic, but there are many, and some of them openly admitted, that they're rather less patriotic than the rest of the country, to put it rather mildly. The second challenge is that today we have a serious breakdown in the transmission of American values, including freedom. If you think this open republic is a great experiment, as George Washington put it, and that idea goes all the way back to the Puritans. John Winthrop was very aware, coming from the book of Deuteronomy, that they, like Israel, had to choose between blessing and cursing. And they could either be a city on a hill or a byword to the nation. It was an open choice, and there were consequences. And that, of course, is behind Washington's notion of the great experiment. Experiments, as you know well, in this highly scientific town, experiments are always open-ended. And the American Republic, too, is open-ended. Now, that means that the American values always have to be transmitted in every generation in two different ways. One is from the older generation to the younger, and that's education. Sadly, not every school in America is like Randolph. You can see in much of the public school education not only a mediocrity in the education, but an absence since the 1960s of civic education. The values aren't being passed on. But it's also true not only in education, but in immigration. In the old days, those who were citizens taught those who were the new arrivals what it meant to be American. And as many people put it now, it's relatively easy to become an American, get your naturalization papers and so on. Increasingly difficult to know what it is to be American, because that very notion is so contentious in certain circles. I've lived in Washington nearly 30 years. I've heard the immigration debate go on and on. English as a second language, border control, economic this, that, and the other, pathways to this. I've never heard anyone talk about citizenship education for those who come into the country. So Samuel Huntington pointed out, soon, because of this, and it's not being handed on, immigration will put more of a stamp on America than the revolution itself. The values are no longer handed on as they used to be. But the third modern crisis is the deepest of all in many ways, and to use Polybius's term, we're seeing a corruption of customs in lots of areas, but I'm referring to freedom tonight. Clearly, if you put it in philosophical terms, the framers' understanding of freedom was both negative, freedom from, but also positive, freedom for. And yet almost all American freedom today is negative only. Freedom from, the permission to do what you like, non-interference. And that's sadly conservative as well as liberal. Get the government off our backs, get the government away from my body. You can see how even many of the conservative champions espouse people like Ayn Rand and her notion of extreme radical libertarianism. And you can see that American freedom now is so negative, so many versions of freedom from, so lacking in any understanding of freedom for, that it is quite literally, in the framers' terms, unsustainable. Do you see the irony there? The word sustainable is a vogue word today, one of the buzzwords. Sustainable environment, sustainable capitalism, sustainable development, everything's got to be sustainable. Scalable and sustainable. We hear it almost daily. But no one talks about sustainable freedom that underlies so much of it. Now, in fact, there could be relatively simple solutions to some of these things. The restoration of civic education. It used to be understood that in a free society, everybody's born free, but not everyone's up to it. They have to be educated for liberty. The Greeks understood that well, and so on. That was liberal education. That was civic education. As I said, it's almost disappeared today. It could be recovered, but it would take extraordinary leadership. So things could be done, but again and again, the crying issue is leadership that stands above all the partisan and the culture warring and speaks to something that is in the interest powerfully of all Americans. But let me finish with this and then throw it over to you for our discussion. And I hope we'll have not just Q&A to me, as it were, but a real discussion, because you are citizens of this great country, and your generation is the crucial one in answering some of these things. Tocqueville, whom I mentioned, I'm sure many of you read in your student days at least, Democracy in America. Americans obviously love it because he was praising American democracy. But he didn't write the books for Americans. He wrote it in French for the Frenchmen. He was a disappointed lover of the French Revolution. And he was a great admirer of this. And he wanted to show the differences to teach the Europeans how freedom could really be established in this new democratic revolution. And all his life, he's comparing and contrasting the two revolutions and what came out of them. But towards the end of his life, in one of his writings, he made this wonderful little comment that speaks to us today. Tocqueville says, with a revolution, as with a novel, the hardest part to invent is the ending. Your founding fathers had their blind spots, but what an incredible first chapter they wrote. No nation probably has ever had so many brilliant, great men all at once. We in Britain have had great leaders from time to time, say Winston Churchill most recently, but never have we had so many at the same time you had it. And of course, you Americans have written many glorious chapters in your history since then, right down to the greatest generation and so on. But there's no question that the next generation will have to answer some of these things that go to the core of what it means to be the American Republic. Or freedom will not be sustained, and the American Republic will decline. And that's the challenge and the task of the next generation. Thank you, and over to you.